Comrades, if it's all right with you, I'd like to get going with the second part of our meeting. We've got at least two fantastic contributions from Paul Bra, founding chairman of the CPGB-ML. And first of all, I would like you, after I finish speaking, to put your hands together for Comrade Steve Sweeney. Steve Sweeney is the international editor of the Morning Star, or one of them. He has got personal experience of having traveled to the Ukraine, visited the Ukraine. There are a lot of people who say you are not entitled to speak about something unless you have direct first-hand experience. And I can understand why that is. Of course, with world politics, you can't have direct first-hand experience of every struggle and every conflict in every corner of the globe, and yet you can have enough political knowledge and insight and information to give really very accurate analysis and commentary from afar, even when relying on hostile sources of information. So we should be wary of that as an argument. It's often one that imperialism uses to silence its critics. Nonetheless, it has been invaluable to have certain voices who do have clear, truthful, and direct first-hand experience of what is happening to weigh that in with our overall analysis. And it's very much in this vein that Steve speaks here today in a personal capacity, but we welcome him to this Workers' Party and CPGB-ML event. So please give a warm round of applause for Steve Sweeney.
Thank you all very much. We had the Chinese ambassadors here earlier, and I wanted to start really by paying my respects to them, but also to those that lost their lives in the Nato bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, which took place 23 years ago yesterday. So don't let anybody tell you that NATO is a defensive alliance. Comrades, first of all, I would like to express my thanks and appreciation to the Workers' Party and the CPGB-ML for putting on today's important event to commemorate Victory Day. And it is more important now than ever that we celebrate the great patriotic war and the victory over fascism in Europe and the tremendous sacrifices that were made by so many. In the words of the great American writer Ernest Hemingway, anybody who loves freedom owes such a debt to the Red Army that it can never be repaid. And comrades, we are gathered here as war rages in Ukraine, and at a time when Russophobia is rampant from government to the mass media. It is a time, comrades, when the foe left, the most craven servants of imperialism, fresh from their demonstration on the streets of London, demanding more arms to Ukraine and a victory for NATO and the imperialist forces, are using Victory Day to organize a protest against Russia. And I tell you this, comrades, if I were in London tomorrow, I would get the biggest red flag that I could find. I would make it to the Russian embassy and I would wave it in honor of the 27 million people whose graves these people are trampling over. Shame on them! Shame on them! And comrades, as Ranjit said in his introduction, I've recently returned from Ukraine, from Poland, and from Berlin. And I'll come to my experiences in all three of those places later in my speech. But I wanted to highlight a very, very important case that may have passed many people by. It certainly passed by the mainstream media. It certainly passed by the so-called warriors for freedom and democracy. It's the case of a journalist and opposition political leader, Anatoly Shary. He is a man who initially actually helped elect President Volodymyr Zelensky, the darling of Western liberals. He's long since broken, actually, with Zelensky, accusing him of reneging on his deal to broker peace in the Donbass region and bring an end to 8 years of war and conflict, not months, but years of conflict. But that spat became more serious. Anatoly Shary was forced into exile. He had to flee the country in fear of his life. And the country where he has taken sanctuary, or that is supposed to be giving him sanctuary, Spain, launched a joint operation with the Ukrainian intelligence forces to arrest him on grounds of high treason on Thursday. Now, he alleges that Zelensky had sent a hit squad to assassinate him. This comes from the testimony of an Azov fascist who was arrested by the Catalan police and interrogated on other crimes. A recent report in Mint Press News, you can read more details about the extensive sting operation against him while he's been holed up in Madrid, in Spain. He faces certain death if he is extradited back to Ukraine. High treason is met with a bullet. And we call for every person in this room, every journalist, every press freedom organisation, every human rights group to oppose this move, to campaign for his freedom, and we call for Spain to uphold his safety and guarantee that his life is not put at risk. Comrades, we really should not underestimate the seriousness of this case, which sets a dangerous precedent where dissidents and those that are seeking sanctuary can be hunted down in Europe and elsewhere by an intelligence service that has been likened to Hitler's SS. And it also highlights we're right to be worried, because this is not an isolated case. We look at journalists that are working in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the Donbass region, journalists like Patrick Lancaster, who has been reporting from the region, and the threats that have been made to his life, when people have been urged to find him and kill him. These are kind of mainstream-ish news organisations that are doing this dirty work on behalf of the imperialists. Eva Bartlett, who many of you will know, is currently also reporting from the region. And she said on Friday that her name has appeared on a government hit list. So we are right to be fearful, as this is happening with blanket silence from the media organisations, government officials, and the faux left, who bend over backwards to downplay the significance and the importance of the fascist forces in Ukraine. In one of the most craven and shameful pieces of journalism I have seen in this country, and let's face it, it's up against some stiff opposition, BBC journalist Ros Atkins gave a masterclass in fascism denial in a 9-minute documentary released just last month. I won't spend too much time on the details of that. For those of you that are interested, you can read my article that I wrote for Al Mayadeen, Hurrah for the Azov, which is in Lalkar, which I believe you can get copies of here, and you can read that article in which I deconstruct his puff piece for Nazism. Of course, the headline is a reference to the perhaps infamous Daily Mail article of the 1930s, written by its billionaire proprietor, Viscount Volodymyr, which had the famous headline, "Hurrah for the Black Shirts," in which he was talking about Oswald Mosley's fascists in Britain, fascists that were also defeated by communists and working people organising. But it's worth a reminder of what Volodymyr said at the time. And he saw the nascent fascist movement then as a bulwark against communism, both at home and abroad. And he urged the British public to study closely the Nazi regime in Germany. And he accused its opponents and critics of deliberately misrepresenting it. Sounds familiar, right? He took aim at those who denounced Nazi atrocities, which he said, well, they merely consist of a few isolated acts of violence, which have been generalized, multiplied, and exaggerated to give the impression that Nazi rule is a bloodthirsty tyranny. Now, we all know what happened there. And this sounds exactly the same as the arguments that are now being deployed to whitewash the very real danger and the very real influence of Nazism in Ukraine. The Nazi forces of the Azov battalion and the Azov movement, which by their own admission seek world domination and are being armed to the teeth by Britain and the West. The blowback of that doesn't bear thinking about. But of course, the West couldn't care one jot about this. It's using Azov as its proxy force, as we've seen in Syria and elsewhere. An imperialist battering ram against Russia, but also behind Russia is China. And this is really what the war is about, in defense of a unipolar world. So let's also remind ourselves of the pernicious role of the European Union in paving the way for the purges of the left and the anti-communist assault that has swept across Ukraine since the Maidan coup of 2014. And of course, this is where the war started, not weeks ago, according to the Liberals. But in 2019, the European Union passed a motion that can only be described as a grotesque falsification of history, equating communism with Nazism. And it used Nazism, by the way, not fascism. It used Nazism specifically, and called for the destruction of statues and monuments and the renaming of streets. And this led to an orgy of anti-communism in Ukraine, the tearing down of statues of Lenin, the statue in Lviv, where I was, the statue of the commander of the Taras Shevchenko Brigade, who fought against Franco's forces in Spain, has been torn down. The Communist Party of Ukraine has been banned, its members and leading officials persecuted and jailed, and its newspaper outlawed. And to their shame, the Labour MEPs, to a person, voted in favour of this ultra-reactionary motion, playing their role as the useful idiots of imperialism once more. Shame on them. Now, thankfully, in my view, we have left that neoliberal economic bloc. But one of the MPs that spoke in that debate, Julie Ward, is now one of the leading lights in the Arm Ukraine Brigade, the pro-imperialist Ukraine solidarity campaign. And these people are a stain on the 80,000 Soviet fighters that gave their lives in the Battle of Berlin, where they broke the back of the Nazi war machine. And I paid tribute to their memory at the Soviet war memorials, including in Treptow Park in Berlin. And these are memorials that have been desecrated with anti-communist, pro-Ukrainian graffiti. These are memorials where the tanks, the first tanks that rolled in to Berlin in 1945, have been draped with the flag of Ukraine. The very forces that those tanks defeated in 1945. And these people, these so-called lovers of freedom and democracy, have said nothing about the Kononovich brothers, two communist youth leaders and anti-fascists detained by the Ukrainian intelligence services in March, detained amid fears that they were being taken away, tortured and possibly executed. And the European Union, Joseph Borrell, has failed to give an answer over the safety and whereabouts of the Kononovich brothers after the Greek Communist Party asked a question in the European Parliament. The Liberals have said nothing. They won't even know the name of Vadim Papura, a 17-year-old who was burned to death in the trade union house in Odessa in 2014, the anniversary of which was very recently, but the anniversary was met with a deafening silence of those that contend to support and show solidarity with Ukraine. He burned to death while Nazi slogans and swastikas were daubed on the building, while police fired their guns, and those outside, the assorted nationalists, fascists and Nazis, sang the Ukrainian national anthem as people burned to their death. Now contrast that, comrades, with the Western media coverage of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girl who sang in a bomb shelter, who was then able to perform that very same anthem that was being sung as people burned to their death to a huge crowd of thousands of people in footage that was then circulated around the world to garner your sympathy for the fascist forces that burned those people to death. Now, this is the real story in Ukraine. It's a story of media manipulation that is trying to portray this in simple terms, as a battle of democracy over dictatorship, good versus evil, where they want us to believe that the powers responsible for destructive wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, the same forces that have funded death squads across Latin America, in the north of Ireland and elsewhere, are the good guys. And you may not have seen, the Reuters report. Very recently, Russia has criticized this, where they have manipulated the voice of an evacuee from Mariupol. And they have implied that she said she hates Russia for what it's done to Ukraine. When in fact, she said the opposite. She said that her and her family would never return to Ukraine. They would only return to an independent, autonomous Donbass, where the rights of Russian speakers are protected. This is a story that I've heard many times in Ukraine from people that have fled from the east, which I will come on to later. But we shouldn't be under any illusion that this is a proxy war between NATO and Russia. Anybody that tries to tell you otherwise is lying to you. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny, comrades. When the truth about what's happening inside Ukraine is far worse than the reality that the Western media would have you believe. Now, as a journalist, I've been into many war zones, many conflict zones. I was recently in Iraq, where I had to smuggle myself into a war zone underneath of a car when, incidentally, we were being bombed every day by NATO. NATO bombs were dropping on civilians. NATO chemical weapons were being used. Hospitals there have been bombed. A UN-administered refugee camp bombed by NATO's second largest army. Of course, to global silence. But it's pretty standard NATO tactics. I mean, this is what they do in every country, in every intervention across the world. They're bombing for peace. But this time I entered Ukraine. For once, I tried to enter Ukraine legitimately. I took a coach from the Polish capital Warsaw to Lviv in the western part of Ukraine, an area which, if you listen to the mainstream media, they will tell you that this area is untouched by the war. Somehow Lviv is shielded from what's happening inside Ukraine. What they're not really telling you, actually, is that Lviv and the western part of Russia is a major point where humanitarian aid organizations, soldiers, and NATO weapons are being shipped into the country. They're being flooded across. I've seen it with my own eyes. And they're doing it surreptitiously because they are using civilian transport networks to take these weapons and soldiers and bring them into Ukraine. And while I was there, Russia, in fact, bombed, I think, targeted some civilian rail networks. But it's been a very low key, actually. And we have to say that the reality is that Russia has showed great restraint and has largely left the transport infrastructure that is being used to ship around the weapons, that is being used to ship around the soldiers. These are largely being left intact. And as a communist, perhaps shouldn't judge people necessarily by their appearance, but on the coach, on the way into Ukraine, I was sat opposite somebody in military fatigues who had a tattoo of a gun on his face and who glared at me rather menacingly during the 11-hour journey. I didn't dare show him my tattoos. But before I went into Ukraine, actually, an American journalist friend of mine said, Steve, I won't do the accent, but he said to me, Steve, your body is illegal in Ukraine. And, my body's been called many things, actually, but it's the first time it's been called illegal. But what he meant, actually, was quite correct. I won't show you, but on my arm, I have a tattoo of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. And, of course, I'm very proud of my tattoo, but I'm also not stupid. So I made sure that I packed lots of long-sleeve shirts and tops so that I could avoid displaying my tattoo. But it was, this is a serious issue because whilst my tattoo of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, heroes of the communist movement, heroes of the working class, are banned, of course, tattoos of swastikas, tattoos of Adolf Hitler, and tattoos displaying any kind of Nazi insignia are absolutely fine. And Lviv, you'll see the pictures in wherever, the BBC or any of the identikit reports that you watch on your television screens or read in your newspapers, and you'll see, oh look, these lovely Ukrainian people, life is carrying on as normal, they're not affected by the war. What they don't show you is that the city is in fact awash of people like the man with the gun tattoo on his face. It is awash with people in military fatigues. It is awash with these faux humanitarian rights organizations that are supposedly there delivering aid. And I'll come on to that in a little bit later as well. And we know that thousands are joining the Ukrainian forces. They've listened to the call of the former actor, now President Volodymyr Zelensky, to come in defense of democracy. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But thousands have joined, and they're on the front line. And there was one British volunteer who, on Friday, said he was kicked out of the British Army, and you'll see this with a lot of the volunteers, by the way. This one was kicked out for thieving. There's others that have been kicked out for fighting or violence, which is a bit odd, but you know. But this particular volunteer was, he wasn't a young man, he was, but he had volunteered, and he said, he told Sky News it's worth reading the interview because it's just for, well, the sheer comedy of it. When he tried to explain, yeah, I signed up for these forces and accidentally joined the Azov battalion. And I mean, how you accidentally join Nazis, I'm not entirely sure, but he didn't object to it, by the way. He said, I accidentally joined them, but, you know, I spoke to them, and they're actually nice blokes. They're all right, you know, these fascists. He was, interestingly, he was in Bucha, and Bucha, as we know, is an area that the truth about what's happened there will come out eventually, by the way. These things will come out, the truth will come out. You know, the reality that is being painted in the Western media is built on sand, and it's crumbling away. And the more people that are coming out of places like Bucha, the more people that are coming out of places like Mariupol, people that I met, are telling a very, very different story. Very different story from the reality that is being portrayed in the Western media. And I'll talk about them and the people that I met. People like Maria, who showed me the destruction of her home in Mariupol, absolutely destroyed. And she had managed to escape from Mariupol, or just outside Mariupol. She wasn't in the city, she had a flat in the city, but her and her daughter managed to escape from Mariupol. Her husband and son were not able to leave. And she told me, she spoke in broken English, but we could understand each other. And she told me that she was not afraid of Russia. She wasn't afraid of the Russian forces. The Russian forces, she said, were giving them food, and were giving them water, and were offering them shelter and sanctuary. This is what she said. And she said that the people that they were terrified of were the Ukrainian armed forces, the fascist forces that she said have terrorized that region and her city, not just for the last 2 months, 3 months, or however long it is, but for the last 8 years. 8 years. And she blamed Azov. She used Azov specifically, and she said it was them that had destroyed her home. The Azov battalion were the people that were firing on them. She said when they tried to flee, the siege of Mariupol that everyone's heard about, she told me that when she tried to flee and her family tried to leave the area because it was being bombarded and the situation was pretty desperate there, she said that they were told if they would leave, we will shoot you. Now, who was it that said that they would shoot them? It wasn't the Russians, but it was the Ukrainians. And it was the fascists that she said they were being held as hostages in Mariupol by the fascist forces. And I heard this many times, actually. Another woman, Nina, said again the same thing. She said she wasn't afraid of the Russians. She said that it was the Ukrainian armed forces that were killing and torturing people. Now, I spoke to her about the reason that I went to Ukraine. Really, was there was a number of stories that I was chasing, a number of things I was looking up for, and we spoke about a dungeon. You may have heard about it. I think the mainstream media reported it probably about 10 lines into a story about something else. But this is quite a bit major story. In the early weeks of the latest round of the conflict, that the Russian forces found a dungeon, a torture dungeon, a Nazi torture dungeon. I reported it in the Morning Star. I didn't recall seeing it anywhere else. But it was called the Bibliothek, or something similar along this line. It means library. And she said, yes, that this is true. that this is something that exists or existed at the airport in Mariupol. And she told me that she knows many, many people that she knows that have disappeared, that have been tortured there, that have never returned. And this was going on for years. And there's a few stories, that we were hearing about forced disappearances. This is the reality, particularly in the eastern part of Ukraine. We're talking about forced disappearances, people living in fear of a knock on the door at night, people fearing the Ukrainian intelligence services. They were speaking about a Ukrainian version of Mossad operating in the area, and we've heard recently about the Israeli forces and their support for Ukraine. People being kidnapped, fear of their neighbours. I mean, they're now talking, they're drawing up lists of undesirable people that they deem to be pro-Russian. And this is now, people are afraid of their neighbour, afraid of something that maybe they have said years ago, or some kind of dispute that they've had that may be turned and used against them, and that they may be arrested. They spoke about not just, we've seen the ban on 11 opposition parties. I mean, this is just the most recent pronouncement by presidential decree in March. Of course, leftist organisations, political parties, trade unionists have been banned for 8 years. This assault has been going on for that length of time. And Nina told me that her friends and neighbours, people she knows, have been disappeared. She has no idea where they were. And she very much doubts whether she will see them again, because the regime is brutal. People are terrified. People are getting shot dead. They're being accused of being traitors. This is the latest thing. High treason and traitors. Hundreds of people. We don't know the figure. She said something like 400 or 500 people, she thinks, have been subjected to this, as the Ukrainian intelligence services, as I said earlier, compared to Hitler's SS, are using the pretext of war to snuff out and eliminate opposition, to snuff out and eliminate the left there. Shooting dead one of their own peace negotiators. I mean, this was something, again, this has passed virtually without comment in the Western press. Imagine that. He was sitting around a table one day negotiating a peace deal. A few days later, shot dead as a traitor. Why was he shot dead as a traitor? Because he was negotiating for peace. And of course, we know that NATO, we know that Britain, we know that the United States don't really want peace. That this is... They don't want peace. They want to exhaust and weaken Russia. They've admitted that. They had the 8 in the Pentagon. They had the 8 largest arms manufacturers in the world came to the Pentagon, and they were told, we need you to produce more weapons. We need you to produce more arms. Because obviously, flooding the region with more arms is going to bring an end to the war. This is pouring petrol on a fire. There are disputes and conflicts that have been smouldering away on the outskirts of Ukraine that have the potential to inflame at any time. So don't let them tell you that NATO is an organisation for peace. Don't let them tell you that the US and Britain and imperialism is a power for good and for freedom and peace and democracy, because it isn't. There's a number of stories that I'm working on that I can't really go into detail about right now, because my investigations are still ongoing. But just to say that they will go some way to uncovering the extent of NATO's covert operations inside Ukraine. We're not talking about on the borders, which we know about. We know that they're encircling the region on the borders, but they are actually active inside Ukraine. They might be doing it under a different guise, under the guise of these private security companies or whatever they call it. But I will tell you that the mask is going to slip, and it will slip very soon, and the full extent of that will be known to hopefully, to the West. I looked, if you remember, right at the beginning of the war, and I can tell you this much, if you remember that there was a training centre on the outskirts of Lviv that was bombed by Russia, and we heard it's just a training centre, there was hardly anybody there, maybe 1 or 2 people died. Well, I can tell you now, that's a lie. That is a lie. Hundreds of people were killed in that attack. And what was going on at that base was something that we'll find the truth out about this. The truth about that will come out. But this is a major base and a major staging post for NATO's forces and NATO's operations inside Ukraine. So don't let them tell you that they're not actively intervening, because I can tell you now that they are. Another organisation, comrades, that is working inside Ukraine, a story that broke in Al-Mayadin earlier this week, again ignored by the Western media. But this is a story about the establishment of a Ukrainian white helmet, which is led by a former YPG fighter from from Syria, with alleged links to the British and the US intelligence services. Now, of course, this slick humanitarian aid organisation is given free rein inside Ukraine. It's given free rein to train the police, to train soldiers, to train security forces. And it says on its website, you can check it out, it is committed to fighting against the enemy, indicating that it is not really a humanitarian organisation after all, but that it plans to engage in some kind of combat against Russia. Now, most sickeningly, the name of this humanitarian organisation, I use the term very, very loosely, is the Nightingale Squadron. Now, this might have some, seem innocent or innocuous enough, but it has chilling connotations for the people of Lviv. The Nightingale Battalion, the Nightingale Battalion, was a Nazi force founded in 1941, and it came under the control of Stepan Bandera's Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Most of its members went on to form the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. 14 of them joined the SS Galicia Division in 1943. The SS Galicia Division was a slogan that was daubed on the House of Trade Unions while the people were burning inside. And this unit was responsible for the death of thousands of Jews over a 4-day period between June and July 1941. And it is their descendants that still hold power and influence in Ukraine today, as the myriad of far-right forces that the Western liberal media will have you believe don't actually exist. But interestingly, as an aside, they keep telling us, the Azov and Right Sector and all these far-right organisations, they're really not very influential in Ukraine, and there's not many of them there. Yet, interestingly, for a force that has very little influence, the BBC manages to seem to find them for every single piece to camera that it does from the region. I mean, astonishingly for such a force that has no influence. But yeah, my experience in Ukraine, again, was interesting. I met many people, as I've explained earlier, and they begged me to tell their stories and to be their voice, because they know what is happening. They know what's happening on the ground, but they also know what is happening in the Western media that is not telling the truth about what's happening in Ukraine. This fairy tale fantasy, by the way, for Western consumption, that somehow plucky Ukraine, is winning the war against Russia, and that Russia is failing, that Russia didn't take Kiev like it planned to do so and install a puppet government there. Everybody knows this, according to Owen Jones and the Western liberals. But in fact, the inverse is the truth. Russia is achieving all of its objectives in Ukraine, and that is very clear. That is very clear. And despite the millions or billions that is being thrown at Ukraine in terms of arms and weapons and soldiers, that is in reality just propping up the military-industrial complex and the profits of the arms companies, and in fact evading the very real and deep economic crisis that is being faced across the Eurozone and in Britain, and the crisis of capitalism. That's what this is, again, we have to remember that's what this is about. Despite all of this, Ukraine is not winning the war, and also, Ukrainians I've spoken to outside of Ukraine. I was in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, and I met some anti-war activists I thought were very brave, in fact, because Poland is not a happy place for the left. It's a very right-wing administration, and they were leafleting against the war in Ukraine in an area where there are thousands of Ukrainian refugees that take to the streets. They were leafleting in that area. But rather than being met with hostility from the Ukrainian refugees were taking their leaflets. The Ukrainian refugees supported their demands and turned out on a demonstration against NATO and against militarization. So my time in Ukraine came to a rather swift and unfortunate end when I was grilled over what my business was inside the country. And they knew I was a journalist. They knew quite a lot about me, actually. They knew I was a journalist, and they told me that I was a spy, that I was a traitor, and that if it was discovered that I was a communist, and it would be, that I would be arrested, I would be interrogated, I would be tortured, and I would be executed. And they told me that I would never be able to leave the country. Obviously I did, because I'm here. But I won't go into the detail of how I managed to get out of the country, because it probably wouldn't be a sensible thing of me to do, but I managed to disguise myself, and I left. I was mistaken for a Ukrainian refugee. I was given a food package. I made sure that I stayed incredibly quiet until I managed to get on a train. I made my way to Berlin. As I got to the border, the German border, the armed police entered the train, and I don't think they were there just for me. They came on and they were checking passports. But most people, they weren't interested in, but when they came to me, they grilled me and they asked me questions about why I was going to Berlin, where I'd been, who I was seeing, how long I was staying for, what was the nature of my business, this kind of thing. And I had a few kind of moments where I thought, this could be a bit of trouble. This trouble kind of follows me around a little bit. I was in jail in Mexico last year at the behest of the United States, and the year before, 2 years before that, I was jailed with ISIS in Turkey, and they decided I was a threat to national security and deported me after threatening to kill me again as well. So I don't have a lot of luck with security forces. But I did get out, and the interesting thing is that all I was armed with in Ukraine was a pen and a camera. That was it. That was all I went in with. Had I gone with a gun tattoo on my face and dressed myself in military fatigues, but had I gone there loaded with arms and weapons, had I gone there with the explicit intent of killing Russians and killing Russian soldiers, they'd have rolled the red carpet out for me. Had I gone there as a pen wielder for imperialism, one of the stenographers for power, and said, "Oh yes, I'm coming, but I'm going to be doing the exact same reporting that the BBC, that Channel 4, that ITV, that CNN, the Guardian, the Times, the Telegraph, etc., who have flooded the area with journalists but never leave the safety of Lviv or never leave the safety of Kiev and just repeat the same identikit reports. Had I been one of those, I'm sure I'd have been welcomed with open arms, but I'm not. I'll never compromise my journalism. As a journalist, it's our job to shine a light into dark places and expose the truth, no matter how difficult or how uncomfortable this may be. But what we're seeing is a desperate attempt, and I say desperate because it's now becoming increasingly more desperate, attempt to control the narrative. Media organizations in Ukraine are shut down. Leftist parties are banned. Opposition figures arrested, tortured, jailed, and even killed. Priests are being kidnapped. This was the other story that I heard from my friends there that was saying, their local church was ransacked by far-right forces. Their local priest was kidnapped. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody's speaking out for these people. Where are their voices in the Guardian and the BBC? Nowhere. But this is where we are. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the country's second largest religious organization, is set to be banned. A bill is going through the Ukrainian parliament at the moment. The opposition platform for life leader, Viktor Medvedchuk, you've probably seen him, was placed under house arrest. And this was last year. Funnily enough, he was placed under house arrest soon after organizing anti-fascist marches on Victory Day. And he was paraded in a sickening sight, badly beaten, amid accusations he was fleeing the country. But he was paraded by the president, by Volodymyr Zelensky, who paraded him as though he was some kind of sickening trophy. Does that sound like a democracy to you? In this country, across the European Union, Russian media organizations have been stopped from operating, depriving the public of an alternative voice. Even George himself has been designated Russian state media by Twitter, a move we should vocally oppose as I do today. But the truth matters. But the truth matters, comrades, and the West, I'm afraid, is being sold a pup. And as communists languish in Ukrainian dungeons, being subjected to torture and who knows what kind of treatment, or even if they are still, in fact, alive, it is right that today we pay tribute to the role of communism in defeating fascism. We must campaign for an end to the ban on the Communist Party of Ukraine, freedom for the Kononovich brothers, and unity to defeat fascism wherever it rears its ugly head and in whatever form it takes. And I'll finish, comrades, with the words of Joseph Stalin on the Great Patriotic War. Ours is a just cause. Victory will be ours. Thank you, comrades.
Would you mind standing up?
Yeah, of course, yeah. I'm here.
Steve, I better take your mic.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the audience for that suggestion. Fantastic, rousing speech. Steve, Comrade Steve Sweeney, thank you so much for being here and showing what journalism should mean, putting our mainstream... putting our mainstream media really to shame. A member of the audience you may have heard shouted, Freedom for Assange, I think that's what she said. But if you need... If you need a better illustration, people say the first casualty of war is the truth. But of course, even between the wars, we're fighting little wars. And even between the big lies, we have the little lies. It's become such a generalized state of mass information. There is, in fact, a continual information war, a continuous psychological operation that's being waged against the working class of all nations, but particularly in the heartlands of the imperialist nations in Britain, in the European Union countries, and in the United States. That's why they talk about world opinion, meaning NATO imperialist policy, with great aplomb, and we all kind of have acquiesced to it to a degree because it's all we're surrounded by, as you say in the identikit reports. It doesn't matter whether you pick up a Harley-Davidson magazine for people who like Harley-Davidsons, or you pick up a home improvement magazine, or you go to your local pub and pick up a Wetherspoons, magazine, or you pick up the Sun, or the Financial Times, or the Guardian, or whatever your favorite, Women's Weekly, the Radio Times. Doesn't matter what you pick up. The freedom of the press, we're told, is exemplified by the fact that this fourth estate has a plethora of journals. You can plug yourself into your podcast and not speak to a person all day. Get on the tube, plug it in, go to work, listen to the news, see it. You're surrounded by this incredibly powerful voice, and we must never forget that just as we have a disgusting political census between the Tory party and the Labour Party, with the Liberal and the Greens, and all the rest of the bourgeois mainstream parties, their incredible, powerful handmaiden. And we saw it in our own election campaigns recently, the extent to which they act hand in glove as the spokespersons, as the mouthpieces of our own imperialist ruling class, so that the truth is crowded out. I compare and contrast what Steve Sweeney said, in his eyewitness accounts, and I've seen them, eyewitness accounts of people who have been terrorized by the fascist Azov battalion, who've been unable to leave their area of fighting, who've been kept there as human shields by the fascist Azov battalion, who are acting as the political wing of the Ukrainian army, and therefore it's not incidental in the fact that there are small numbers. They're in a controlling political point. They are the commissariat. They are a fascist political commissariat that ensures the united fascist action of the Ukrainian military machine. That is what we're seeing. They're there at the highest governmental level. Zelensky himself was powerless in the face of this fascist, shock brigade to change the policy of the country, because they are powerfully connected with NATO, with the United States, with Britain. They were unable to negotiate for peace because Boris Johnson personally went on a mission and told him you mustn't do so, as did the German Chancellor, as did Joe Biden. Not in person, but not in person, but via their plenipotentiaries and in phone calls when they can get through. This is NATO's handprint all over it. NATO has intervened in Ukraine. NATO has de facto taken over Ukraine. That's why there are chemical laboratories and biological laboratories throughout Ukraine. First of all, it was denied. Suddenly, Victoria Nuland, her that gives biscuits to the fascists in the Maidan Square during the coup, telling you, yes, we do have them. They're purely, don't worry about them. Yes, they're staffed by NATO. Yes, they're staffed by US military. Yes, Hunter Biden may have had a minor role in their financing. Yes, okay, they're deeply connected to the US Pentagon, military industrial complex. But don't worry, they're just for civilian purposes, just for helping. They're just there to help. Doesn't matter that they're all around, and so on and so. The more you go into it, the more you see the evidence. Compare and contrast a factual report given by an honest journalist who was threatened with his life to, for example, Elise Doucette. Do you know Elise Doucette? a reporter for the BBC, very prominently put forward. I turned on radio. This has done one thing for me, this latest conflict. I've almost totally turned off the BBC. I've almost totally turned out mainstream media. You can't do so absolutely because you have to be aware of the narrative they're spinning in order to counter it. But as a source of even remote, the lies and disinformation are continuous. I had a 10-minute, turned it on one morning, about to go into an operating list, turned it on, see what's on Radio 4, today's program. Elise Doucette, coming from Ukraine, she gave a 10-minute interview filled with what facts and information. She went to a coffee shop called the Oz Coffee Shop in Ukraine by nice middle-class people, just like you and I. White European people was the kind of implication. They enjoy a nice cup of coffee. They have cultural links with Australia. They're just like us. We'd probably go to a similar coffee shop like that. And they're having nice coffee, and they're people who are a bit worried about what's going on. But, they're all very supportive. And now the nice thing is they've turned their coffee shop into a station of solidarity with the armed forces of Ukraine. And little by introduction, they show you the human face of the fascist force of this war. So actually no information, total absence of information, total sympathy piece, trying to wring our hearts and say, aren't we just like the poor Ukrainian fascists fighting Russia, without any context, any history, any real information. So it's really refreshing to have that, and always reminds us that when we are looking to spread real knowledge to the British working class, we have a very powerful enemy in British imperialism that is able to, at the same time, commit crimes and simultaneously paint itself as the great benefactor, the great provider of charity, that force which stands up for democracy, human rights, freedom of speech. We just must be aware and make sure that others are aware of the vast gulf that separates the words from the real deeds,